Hello everyone, I'm Nökkvi from Birds of Play, and in this video we're going to be discussing Final Fantasy Lost Stranger, an original manga series bearing the Final Fantasy name. But is it worthy of the Final Fantasy name? And does it add anything to our appreciation of the series as a whole? Let's find out. So, as a Final Fantasy spin-off project, Final Fantasy Lost Stranger steps into some fairly dangerous waters, as such projects haven't always been all that successful. Take for example Final Fantasy The Spirits Within, which a lot of Final Fantasy fans won't even recognize as a Final Fantasy film, or the largely forgotten Final Fantasy Legends of the Crystal OVA series, or perhaps the most similar project to this one, Final Fantasy Unlimited, which never achieved much acclaim, having started serialization in 2017 and not made any big waves yet. It seems fairly likely that Final Fantasy Lost Stranger is going to suffer the same fate in a way. That being said, it is still ongoing with 9 volumes out here in Japan, and I think 7 volumes have already been translated into English to reach a wider audience, which is fantastic, yes. But don't worry, I won't spoil anything, aside from just the basic synopsis of the story. So, Final Fantasy Lost Stranger tells the story of Sasaki Shogo, this guy here, who is a huge Final Fantasy fan and has always dreamt of one day making his own Final Fantasy game. Who hasn't? In order to accomplish this, he lands a job at Square Enix, but somewhere along the way his dreams start to fade. He stops believing that he can achieve his dream. However, his sister Yuko, who has also gotten a job at Square Enix so that they can achieve their dream together, still has faith in her brother. But before they can take that any further, in classic isekai fashion, they are hit by a truck and transported into another world. A world that is largely inspired by Final Fantasy games. And there they meet some adventurers who agree to let them join their party, and so begins their journey back home. And that's basically the story, even though there is a big twist that I don't want to spoil that adds even more intrigue. But yeah, at its heart, this is very much a manga for Final Fantasy fans, since the references to the games aren't just secondary or in the background. Shogo's love and knowledge about the Final Fantasy series is actually something the party has to rely on again and again in every major encounter so far, whether they are fighting the Mist Dragon from Final Fantasy IV or Biblos from Final Fantasy V. Shogo will always have some sort of insight, even if things end up turning out a bit differently than in the games, which is just fun, really. At its best, I think the manga does a very memorable job of dramatizing things we often take for granted in the games themselves. So for example, magic like Reflect, which has of course been featured in a lot of games, and abilities like the Stock Command from Final Fantasy VIII or Libra get recontextualized within the new world, not only as things to be done, but rather as elements that drive the story forward, letting us think about them a little bit more up close and personal from the perspective of these characters, in terms of how people might actually inhabit a world where such abilities existed, all the while being treated to commentary from Shogo about how they function in the games. So there is a sort of comparison or comparative aspect that is perhaps more enjoyable than it sounds. But speaking of people and characters, I think character development is really one of the manga's weak points, actually. For example, the party Shogo and his sister end up joining consists of these 3 characters: Sharuru, which is a white mage, Rei, who is a sort of axe-wielding tank, marauder type class, and Dustin, who is a black mage, but they're all introduced at the same time and in a very superficial fashion, so for a very long time they're basically just along for the ride, it seems. The adventure itself seems to be prioritized over the characters, the plot doing very little to make them particularly compelling. The manga is starting to address this issue, but it still feels a bit weird that for like the first 5 volumes. This is the 4th. So for the first 5 volumes or so, they were just kind of there, and Shoko was basically the only member of the main cast worth mentioning. As a manga, Final Fantasy Lost Stranger isn't pushing any boundaries, which is a bit of a shame, since one of the hallmarks of the Final Fantasy series, at least by my estimation, has to some degree been innovation and playing with the limits of what can be done at any given time with any given medium, mostly games of course. Lost Stranger relies quite heavily on melodramatic revelations, which are common to a lot of manga, in a way that can even start to feel a bit formulaic at times, as the reader is led from one revelation to the next in a fairly familiar fashion, with pages first conveying desperation before that desperation is subverted and turned into something hopeful and inspiring and uplifting. The art, I think, the art style is quite serviceable, I think, although it doesn't really elicit the same level of visual intrigue that Final Fantasy games often do. At first, when you start reading it, the manga seems to take the most inspiration from Final Fantasy XIV, but then as the story progresses, the references become a lot more balanced and overlapping, resulting in a sort of love letter to the Final Fantasy series that is as rewarding to read through as I imagine the reader being familiar with the Final Fantasy series. So the more familiar you are with the series, the more enjoyment you are likely to take away from this. Final Fantasy Lost Stranger isn't anything revolutionary, and in a way it makes me a bit sad that Final Fantasy Unlimited didn't ever live up to its full potential to explore its imaginative setting and cast. That being said, I'm still going to give Final Fantasy Lost Stranger my recommendation, because I would be lying if I said I hadn't been enjoying reading through it so far and that I wasn't looking forward to reading more. But what do you think? Have you read Final Fantasy Lost Stranger, or are you interested in reading it? Tell us down in the comments below. But until next time,